So welcome everybody, and a special welcome to Sam Illingworth, who is our presenting professor today at the researcher's desk. My name is Romina Martin, and I'm very happy to have you here today to learn more about using games, particular tabletop games, to learn about the climate crisis. And so the floor is yours, Sam. I'm great you're here.
Great, thank you so much, Romina. So I've just shared my slides with everyone in the chat, so feel free to download them and use them as you want. And I'm going to talk for about 20-25 minutes, then got open questions as well. So very briefly, I guess, my background. So I'm an associate professor at Edinburgh Napier University, where my research and practice involve using games and poetry as a way of developing dialogues between different groups, and in particular, platforming the voices of marginalized and underserved communities. If you want to get in contact with me, please feel free to drop me an email or connect with me on X, or visit my website. And obviously, if you've got any questions as well, really happy to answer any of them that you might have. So I just want to really start this presentation with a hypothesis. And this is that a creative approach can help to diversify how the climate crisis is communicated, discussed, and acted upon. And the creativity that I'm going to be talking about today is poetry and games, because they're the two creative medium through which I'm the most au fait. But a lot of this learning might be used elsewhere as well. But I just want to start off, first of all, by looking at this. So this is what I would call a spectrum of communication. So there's various ways in which we can communicate science and the climate crisis to different communities. And this spectrum is not hierarchical. It's not to say one end is better than the other, they're just different. So on one end of the spectrum, we would have dissemination. So this is the one-way communication of ideas from a scientific to a non-scientific audience. There's still very much a role for this in climate communication strategies. So if we think about things such as David Attenborough documentaries or podcasts, or even conversation articles like the one that Roman has shared with you, that's a great example of one-way communication of ideas. Moving along the spectrum, we move into a dialogue. So a dialogue would be a two-way exchange of ideas, wherein the scientific researcher not only shares their ideas with a non-scientific audience, but also invites that non-scientific audience to share their expertise with them. So to give you an example of this, I always think about flood risk mitigation. So imagine, if you will, that I'm designing flood risk strategies for an inner city over the next 50 years, as we know will be the impact from the climate crisis. Now, I can look as a researcher at data records, satellite measurements, in situ responses. But if I don't talk to the inhabitants of that area, then I'm missing out on a massive data set. So if I talk to these people, I'll find out people that have lived there for 40, 50, 60, 70 years. I'll find out additional areas that are flooded. I'll find out areas where they know that the strategies that I'm suggesting won't work. We'll find out communities that might struggle to implement those strategies. So the reason that we engage with communities in a two-way dialogue isn't just a box-ticking exercise, it's actually because it helps us to implement and develop ideas. Now, I'll come back to this, but one of the biggest problems we have when initiating that dialogue is that we have established what I call hierarchies of intellect. So as a scientist, even if I'm very non-patronizing, very inclusive, when I talk to a non-scientist, even though they have their own expertise and lived experience and tacit knowledge, they might feel intimidated by the letters after my name or the fact that I'm from an institute. And so we need to try to, in order to have effective dialogue and an exchange of two-way conversations, we need to try and level those hierarchies, which is what I'll come back to. And then at the final end of the spectrum, we have participation. So this is thinking about projects like citizen science, citizens' assemblies, where we're actually involving non-scientists in the whole process, from research design through to analysis, through to dissemination as well. So this is just to say really that effective communication exists across this spectrum, and there's a role for dissemination, there's a role for dialogue, and there's a role for participation. And when we're thinking about communicating the climate crisis to different audiences, that's what we need to do. Another thing to note here is that there is no such thing as the general public. There are multiple publics, multiple audiences. When I think about myself, you know, I am a scientist, but I'm also a father, a husband, a Christian, a runner, a gamer, a Leeds United fan. Like, these are all parts of the identity that I have. And depending on what hat I'm wearing, I will engage with media in different ways. So broad approaches to try to communicate to all audiences just don't work. And instead, when we're thinking about how we're going to communicate, where on the spectrum we're going to communicate, we need to think about which publics specifically we're dealing with. So the rest of my talk now, I'm going to break down into looking at how we can use poetry and games across this spectrum to try to disseminate, encourage dialogue, and ultimately think about participation and action against the climate crisis. So let's start with poetry and using poetry to disseminate. So I have a blog called The Poetry of Science, where each week I read a piece of scientific research and write a poem about it. And the idea is to try to bring scientific research to a new audience. And my background is in climate change and climate change research. So a lot of the poems are about the climate crisis. And I have an accompanying podcast, and it's relatively successful. When I started this 8 years ago, I think I had about 5 people reading it a month. And then last year I had 160,000 people reading my blog and about 120,000 people listening to my podcast. So it's quite successful. You can check out the links there. And like I say, each week I read a piece of scientific research. I write a non-expert summary about that research, link to the research. I try to pick open access journals, and then also write a poem. And the poems used to be very didactic, so very much trying to explain the research in quite horrible rhymes. Whereas it's very much evolved over the years so that the poems themselves don't necessarily have to explain the research. That's what the summary does, but rather they represent the research through a new lens. So what this means is that as well as targeting an audience of non-scientists to encounter the research in a way that's maybe more familiar or more accessible, it also encourages scientists to review their research through an additional lens. So I want to give you an example of what this might look like in practice. So this is a paper published last year, which was about the effects of wildfire smoke on how cows lactate. This was an amazing piece of research that basically looked at how in the US, 25% of all dairy milk is produced in this one area around Wisconsin, I think. And they had huge wildfires. And what they found was that wildfires have a massive impact on a cow's capacity to lactate. I'm massively simplifying here, but it kind of scares the cows and it delays their lactation periods, which can upset the entire process, because if you imagine the whole cycle of milk production relies upon very specific timings. So wildfires will ultimately, or could certainly in the future, have a catastrophic impact on the entire dairy production industry of the United States. So to me, this is like pretty important research, and I'd never heard about it. And I read this paper. It's a very, very well-written abstract, but for somebody who's not an expert, it's maybe a little bit off-putting. Like even something like PM, like particulate matter, people might not know. PM 2.5, a non-expert might not know what that is. So I wrote this poem about it. Summer's drought erupts as thirsty soils and crowded scrubs ignite. Blistered winds tear across the sky, dusting each breath with heat and soot and blight. In hazy fields they wait, unwary monoliths of black and white, lying prone beneath our blazing, tainted sheet. Lactation lacerated by the febrile touch of our distant, tainted hands. And, you know, I know from my statistics and my comments and stuff that my blog is a relatively effective way of disseminating information about the climate crisis to a non-scientific audience. But where I think poetry is incredibly effective is in developing dialogue. And the reason for this is because, going back to what I talked about earlier, it's a really powerful medium for leveling hierarchies. So what I do in this work, in this research, I've done many hundreds of times now, is we bring scientists and non-scientists together and we write poetry together, and we use that poetry writing as a start for dialogue. And this works for three reasons. One, it gives permission to the non-scientists to share, because it's much harder to criticize or to feel as though you're going to be criticized on a poem than a scientific opinion. Number two, it gives permission to the scientist to display an element of emotion or pathos that they're not normally allowed to share. And number three, it creates a shared sense of vulnerability that helps to break down these hierarchies. Because when you see a professor stand up and read a very badly rhymed poem, or a dirty limerick, or a terrible haiku, you kind of realize that, oh, actually they're fallible and we're all part of this together. So these are two papers that I've written about, and in particular, they're great for helping to platform the voices of marginalized groups. So communities of color, people living with disabilities, refugees, asylum seekers, people living with severe mental health needs. And they've been transformative. Like, so I think about one workshop in particular, the paper on the left there, where we went and worked with a group of people living with severe mental health needs in inner city Manchester. And these people were living on the busiest bus route in Europe. So you can imagine incredible high levels of air pollution. And they didn't know about it. So in these workshops, we'd say, what do you want to talk about? Let's write some poems about it. And then let's discuss the idea that comes out through this poetry with some of the invited scientists. So we had this whole session where we talked about air pollution and what it meant. And one of them wrote this poem that's just always stuck with me. I've never seen pollution, never noticed it. It's always been here, but I'm unaware of it. Just breathing it in. And for me, those 5 lines are so impactful and such a key reminder that actually when we talk about the climate crisis and when we come up with our ideas of going vegan and not flying and doing all of these other things, oftentimes the people who are the most impacted are the people who themselves have the lowest carbon footprint, but also have no idea what's going on. So it's really important that we use poetry as a way to help platform these voices so that we can better understand the people behind the statistics that we look at. And then poetry is also like a really powerful way to participate and to engender action, maybe not in the way that you think I would talk about there. So I set up this journal about 2.5 years ago called Consilience, and it's the world's first peer-reviewed poetry and science journal. So people submit their work to us, and unlike a traditional poetry journal where it's either perfect or rejected, we use the peer review model. So people submit their work, and then each poem goes out to 2 independent reviewers, and then they provide a review and some comments, and then give that back to a handling editor, and then the handling editor works with the poet or the artist on developing their work. And since we launched in 2021, we've had published the work of over 230 poets. We're a team now of 90 volunteers across 6 continents. We've just published issue 14, which is all about structure. All the links are there, and you're very welcome to join us. But what this has shown us is that there's a community out there of people who are interested in the climate crisis, who are interested in environmental science, who have a lot to say about it, but who aren't scientists. And similarly, a lot of scientists who have ways to talk about their research through non-academic papers. And this is really starting, and we're only at the start of this journey in terms of developing participation, but this is in which we might do it. I'll just skip past that, just a poem again. So moving on to games then, and how games, we might also use games for dissemination, for dialogue, and for participation. So when I'm talking about games here, I'm talking about tabletop games, so games that we play around a table. So board games, card games, role-playing games. You know, and tabletop games as well are great and have their own unique benefits. So for me, the strength of a tabletop game lies in the creation of a safe space in which to engage in discussions of complex and at times contentious topics, and in enabling people to take control of their own learning. What do I mean by that? So basically, when you play a game, you enter into a contract with the other players that suspends the reality that exists away from the tabletop. So that means that you can level those hierarchies, because those hierarchies away from the table don't exist at the table. So imagine, for example, that we're playing Monopoly. Now in Monopoly, it's perfectly normal, indeed advisable, to try and bankrupt your opponents. Behavior that would be morally repugnant away from the tabletop. But when we're at the tabletop, we enter into a new negotiation, a new contract, which means that we can start to have behaviors and patterns that then make difficult conversations possible. So we can think about using games to communicate or to disseminate. This is a game or an expansion for a game that I designed with my colleague Paul Wake called Catan Global Warming. So Catan is probably the 3rd most popular game in the world. For people who don't know it, it is a game designed by a German dentist called Hans Klauber. And basically you take on a role of island settlers who want to use up resources to create villages, roads, towns, etc. And whoever makes the most is the winner. You know, we might see this as a rampant comment on capitalism. So the problem with Catan is that there's infinite resources, which we know is not true. So Paul and I redesigned an expansion of this game in which there are limited resources, and actually when you use them, it creates a greenhouse effect. And we wrote about that, and we played it, and many thousands of people have played this game, and it's, you know, led to several newspaper articles, and it's a great way of talking about the climate crisis and encouraging people to maybe find out a little bit more about it through playing games. But again, where games are really powerful is in this development of dialogue. So in 2018, Paul and I were commissioned by the UK climate charity Possible to design a game that started dialogue around heat decarbonisation. So the idea that we need to decarbonise our homes, basically, as well as other industries. And it really struck me that that in the UK, we need to basically, in order to reach our targets, which our Prime Minister may or may not have reneged on, but in order to meet those targets, we need to be retrofitting 20,000 homes per week with better heat sources. At the moment, we're doing that per year. So this is a huge issue that people aren't talking about. So we wanted to design a game. So we set about working with multiple communities, researchers, policymakers, industry experts, activists, journalists, school children, about what kind of game would enable dialogue. And we basically settled on this idea called Carbon City Zero, where you take on the role of a mayor and you compete against your fellow mayors to try to create the most, I guess, carbon efficient city that you can. This gives you an idea of how we designed the game. We started off, very, very basic images, and then the middle image is the best that I could possibly do using PowerPoint. And then we worked with a professional graphic designer, an artist called Tony Pickering. And we created this game called Carbon City Zero, which you can see here, which we actually launched on Kickstarter. We raised like 40 or 50,000 euros, distributed the games to several thousand people, which was really cool. And we know that the game's been played several times. But what was really powerful was that as we co-created this game, we listened to the voices of the activists, the policymakers, the business experts, the academics in creating this game. And as we were creating this game, we got feedback. And one of the feedbacks that we got from people was, this is a great game, but why is it competitive? This is sending the wrong message. Surely, if we're interested about decarbonising our cities, we should be collaborative. So we might have a little bit of gentle competition to do the world's first zero carbon city. And should it be Manchester? Should it be Stockholm? Should it be Oslo? But instead, let's make it collaborative. So me and Paul said, you know what? That's a really good comment. So Paul and I redesigned the whole game and made Carbon City Zero World Edition, which is actually a collaborative game. So instead of having different city mayors to compete against each other, you work collectively and collaboratively, and you either all win together or you all lose together, which for me is quite a powerful statement about the climate crisis. This isn't something that affects all of us at varying degrees, but we all win or we all lose together ultimately. And we know that this was a really effective way of developing dialogue because we used the dialogue to design the game. Incidentally, this game, if you Google Carbon City Zero, it's now actually been professionally produced by a publisher called Lawrence King Publisher. So you can buy it on Amazon. It's pretty cool. And it is, I would say this because I designed it, but it is a really good game. It takes about 40-50 minutes to play, about 10 minutes to explain. And it's just a really great way of talking about the climate crisis with people who do or don't know about it. So for people who are interested and have ideas for Christmas, do think about it. My royalties are so small that I'm not really going to make any money off it. So I'm not saying this is a marketing exercise. I'm saying it, please. It's a great way of starting to talk about the climate crisis. And we know that it's a great way to elicit action, because some of the feedback that we got, this is from one of the Facebook groups, was that, and followed up with this, one of the town councillors was actually using the game to start talking about zero carbon policies in their town hall meetings going forward. So that was like a really powerful reminder to us about how we can potentially use games to not just disseminate, to not just establish dialogue, but to ultimately participate and elicit action as well. So to return to my original hypothesis at the start of this presentation, I believe I've presented how a creative approach, in this case poetry and games, can help to diversify how the climate crisis is communicated, discussed and acted upon. And again, just to reiterate, a lot of my work is about platforming the voices of marginalized communities. And I do this not only because it's ethically the right thing to do, but ultimately because if everybody who's coming up with ideas to solve the climate crisis looks like me, white, heterosexual, cisgendered, Western male, then we're going to have the same solutions that have arguably got us into this problem in the first place. And actually, poetry and games are a really powerful way of helping to diversify, of helping to not give voice, because these people already have a voice, but to platform those voices so that we can help diversify our approach, listen to the solutions, and, you know, move beyond some of the less diverse, less helpful suggestions that we've had in the past. For people who are interested, I've also created a handbook which is available for open access called Community Engagement for Researchers. You can download via that link, or the links are in the PowerPoint presentation, and I can follow up as well with any questions or comments you might have. And just a final plug, for people who are interested in this work, we're running a CPD course on science communication through poetry, about how you can use poetry to communicate science, the climate crisis, but other areas as well. It's running over 4 weeks in October and November. It's open to everybody. There's a small fee, it's really not very much, but there are bursaries available as well. And the sign up has been absolutely insane, like very, very high. So it's a great way to bring people to communities of practice together. And if you want to talk about that, I'm really happy to talk about that as well. So thank you very much for listening to me. There's my details. If you've got any questions, please just let me know. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can see you all, and I'm happy to take any questions you might have. Thanks for listening.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Sam.